Today's webinar is really important. You know, it's the 6th. It's going to wrap up this workshop. And what we're doing here is really to get down to next steps. What do we need to do in terms of identifying outcomes for trainings? And I won't get into too many specifics at this point. I want to let Chris describe a little bit where we're going. But what Chris is going to start us off with is kind of a recap of what we've discussed over the past 5 webinars in terms of what we've uncovered, in terms of who needs to be trained, some of the discussion we've had about substantive issues and subject matters that we need to train on. We talked before about providers of training, both private and public, as well as methods of delivering online, in person, in the field, what have you, as well as a very important question last week of quality assurance. How do we know that the trainings are good and actually accomplishing what we want them to accomplish? So that's where we're headed today, and we're really hoping to have results from this webinar that will move us forward and go beyond the webinar. So I really encourage all of you to actively engage in the conversation today. And but for now, I'm going to hand it over to Chris. Chris.
Okay, and I'll let you know when I'm going to. Okay, right, got it. Okay, I'll be showing you some things on the screen in just a little bit.
Okay.
So let's start off. Okay, great. Okay, I'd like to begin. I'd like to take you back to the context of why we're here and what we hope to achieve. Much has been done to move away from the perception of PSCs and PMCs as mercenaries who operate outside of or contrary to international law. There's been a growing awareness that PMC-related activities such as logistic support, maintenance and operation of some weapon systems, and training have been part of military operations throughout history and are covered under the existing laws of armed conflict. Commercially provided security services do not exist in a regulatory or legal vacuum either. They've also been part of overall security plans for many years. For example, Abraham Lincoln and senior military officers of the Union forces were protected by contractors working for the Pinkerton Detective Agency during and after the time that the first coherent laws of armed conflict were written. By the way, this is a good time to mention that this year is the sesquicentennial of those rules, the Lieber Code, which went on to form the basis of the First Geneva Convention. And much of the language in that Lieber Code is still reflected in the Geneva Conventions themselves. That PSCs and PMCs did not exist in a legal vacuum was the subject of a colloquium sponsored by the College of Europe in 2005. That same colloquium concluded, however, that although there was theoretical accountability under the law, in practice there were gaps in the application of these laws. The Montreux document, concluded 5 years ago, reminded states and other interested parties that certain well-established rules of international law apply to states in their relations with these contractors and in their operations during armed conflict. The Montreux document then provided a framework for states to assist them in developing their own laws, regulations, and policies to close these accountability gaps. The Montreux document included specific training obligations and recommendations for PSCs, for those that contract for such services, and those that exercise operational control over those contractors. These training requirements have been reflected, expanded, and developed in various national regulations, the International Code of Conduct, and the Private Security Company Quality Assurance Management Standards. What is missing to date is a vision for translating these training requirements to meet real-world demands of incorporating PSCs in armed conflict, and more commonly, in post-conflict and other comparable situations. For example, when the Montreux document says that there's an obligation to train PSC personnel and the persons responsible for their employment and operations in international humanitarian law, or as I prefer to say, the laws and customs of war, what does that mean? Does that mean the same thing for different population groups within those general categories? To date, we've said no, but I think we need to move on to be a little bit more specific. How might that training be delivered, and how do we know that we did it right, that it is having the effect that we want? That's why we've been here, to start on the path and answering these questions. To do this, we've listened to panels of experts from different fields of endeavor and war-game these situations using a fictional scenario that has been strongly rooted in recent historic events. Using this information, we collectively identified the following population groups as needing training. Okay. Rebecca, does everybody see that now?
Sorry, I was.
Okay, I just was wondering whether make sure that it worked and everybody's seeing that now. So we have private military and private security company training managers, international staff, local national staff, recognizing that international staff and local national staff will have different training requirements, military planners, military personnel in the area, contracting state officials responsible for regulating the company, contracting state officials who are managing contracts for the company who may not be the same people, home state government officials responsible for authorizing and licensing PSCs, people in the local NGO community who operate in the same environment, international NGO staff responsible for security management, commercial organizations who have the staff responsibility for security management, boards of directors of NGOs, boards of directors of commercial entities who may hire NGOs, umbrella organizations which develop or promote security management policies, and donors to the NGOs themselves, because in a way they have responsibility for the money that they are donating. We identified the following subjects as needing training, including international humanitarian law, human rights law, other relevant international law, relevant national law, cultural awareness, sexual exploitation and abuse, gender-based violence, counter-trafficking of persons, measures against bribery and corruption, interactions between PSCs and PMCs, and all the rest that I will let you read, and I'm not going to actually say. It's a broad spectrum of training that has to be done in order to apply, to use these PSCs in an operational context. Now, when we look at this, we almost have to ask ourselves, is this list exhaustive? And maybe it's not. And how does this relate to the training that we even provide to public security forces? Do military forces have to have training in all of these things? Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't remember going through all of this training when, in the 30 years that I was on active duty. But certainly we have identified, we didn't just come at these off the top of our heads. All of these are existing in regulations, laws, the Montreux document, the Code of Conduct, and so on. It's really a challenging list to even attempt to tackle. After we identified the training that what needs to be trained, we identified that training can be delivered through a combination of classroom, online, virtual simulation, and practical field training. And that training developers and providers could include commercial training providers, academics and institutions, NGOs, government training providers, and in-house training delivered by the staff of various organizations needing the training. But that not all methods of delivery and not all subjects are equally suitable to all potential providers. We sent you all a matrix aligning various combinations of who, what, how, and by whom for your input as the baseline to move forward. But where are we moving forward to?
Chris, if I may just interrupt.
Yeah.
Sorry, Chris, may I just interrupt for 1 second? In case we have anyone who wasn't on the webinar where we had circulated and discussed the matrix, you can go to our website, www.ihrib.org, and I believe it was during the 4th webinar that we circulated the matrix. It's up on the website if you want to open that up for the discussion. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
And I've just opened up the matrix right now.
Perfect. Okay, great.
Okay. But where are we moving forward to? That's what we need to determine. I think we have a good baseline to move forward from, but now we have to decide where that's going. Over the past 5 seminars, I've mentioned several times the notion of learning outcomes. That is, what is it particularly that a static guard on a security contract needs to know to do his job? For example, within that, what elements of human rights law affect his performance of duty, and how might that training be delivered? In another subject, what are the minimum standards in weapons proficiency that any client should be able to expect of a PSC so that they can effectively use their weapons in self-defense and defense of the client while not causing undue risk to innocent parties. What I hope to do over the remaining period that we're here is to talk together, to collectively review the information previously sent to you, and work on a way forward to identify agreed training outcomes. The strategic intent is then for different organizations to take on the challenge of developing training to meet those outcomes, and for some, maybe making a little money in the provision of that training. Now, we're not going to be able to solve all of these things right now. What I would like to see happen, and what I hope we would all like to see happen, is for us to be able to identify small groups that we can work together to take on one or more of these major training events. And I might point out international law, human rights law, cultural awareness training. And then to sit down and say, okay, what does that actually mean? What does an individual need to know? And who needs to know that? If we could work together in small groups and move on from there. But before we do that, we have to be sure that the matrices that have been sent out to you right now are in fact correct. And as we move forward, I would like to mention again, and thank you very much to the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime that have already taken on the issue of rules for the use of force in terms of a handbook. The first draft of that handbook is being reviewed right now by the committee that's developing it, and will soon be available for the broader public to come to take a look at, and then come together, we hope, over the next few months to be able to have a workshop to finalize that thing. So with that, I'd like to throw it open to the floor, and hopefully we get some participation.
Yeah, and Chris, you just reminded me of something I forgot to do at the outset. You mentioned UN Office of Drug and Crime. They are one of our co-sponsors, as is the Institute for International Humanitarian Law, the C Center, which houses the Private Security Monitor Project, and the International NGO Safety and Security Association. So apologies for not recognizing our co-sponsors at the outset there. But so what we're going to do now, since Chris has opened it up for discussion, is we're going to test this. So if you're at home, maybe with kids or dogs or whatever, please self-mute. You can self-mute by hitting the symbol with the microphone that's by your name. And so, Mohammed, let's just give it a shot. We're going to try to unmute all. And okay, sorry, we just tested that. We just unmuted myself by mistake. So now we're going to unmute all of you in the audience so that you can speak. You're going to want to unmute yourself. Are you unmute? Okay, so we're going to try this and see if it works.
Muted.
And so we'll have to go back and forth on the list because it's a really long list of the things that need to be trained. We'll take it each at a time and make sure that within each one of these areas that A, we've captured all the areas, and B, we've captured the people that need to be trained.
Okay. So Chris has a screen up. So again, I'm going to ask everybody, all of you who are attending, you have the ability to mute yourself. Please mute yourself unless you want to speak. Otherwise, we're going to have to do it like very laboriously through raising the hand rather than a discussion. All right. Let me just give everyone a second here. Okay. All right. Looks like our sound quality just improved. I think everyone's muting themselves. Okay. Okay. Great. Chris, there seems to be a message, I think, coming on your screen. Do you want to close that window so we can see the document behind it? Perfect. Okay.
I can see it better now, too.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm just going to, Chris, throw it open for discussion. We're now on, this is, which page are we on now, Chris, in the matrix? This is the interlinking between the who needs to be trained with the what needs to be trained, right?
Right. Yeah, this is sheet 2 that was sent out, and we're looking at the first 6 elements of that very, very long list and making sure that we have accurately captured the who and aligning it to the what.
I think we're going to have to, sorry Chris, I think we're going to have to mute people. People aren't self-muting. Okay, so I think we're going to have to mute everybody because it's just we're getting too much feedback. Oh, okay, great. Mohammed took care of that. So, and so if you find yourself muted, it's because Mohammed's conceding that you do not mute yourself. So if you want to be unmuted, you're going to have to send us a raise your hand. Okay, there we go. That's good sound quality. Okay, sorry about that. We're testing out a new method here. Okay. So any kind of comments or feedback? If not, I actually have one to get things started. Okay, well, so one of my things I was going to suggest is in terms of the category of other relevant international law, I think we want to also think more broadly about the larger standards landscape that is relevant for private military and security companies, in particular with regards to their ability to ensure that they're respecting humanitarian law and human rights. And I think it would be, for example, important, at least at the managerial level, to have some familiarity with other types of business and human rights standards, like the guiding principles in business and human rights. So that's something I would maybe amend under the maybe write other relevant international law and international standards. There's other ISO standards as well that you know are relevant for the industry. So maybe that would be, and I maybe subsume it somehow underneath that, because I think one thing Chris and I had discussed was that in this long list, and you only see the first 6 or 7 here on the screen, but in this long list that Chris showed before, some of this might be able to be effectively merged together. So, for example, it would be conceivable that some of the training with regards to gender issues might fall under, actually cultural awareness or human rights. So there's definitely degrees of overlap, I think. And it might be good in some ways to kind of figure out how to condense things, but at the same time make sure everything's covered. So I'll shut up there and open it up for others. You can just jump in, unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, Rebecca. Sorry, it's Mike Etcherton. On a couple of these, I note that the contracting government, contracting state officials, either responsible for the contracting or the regulation, aren't included, particularly in the categories of human rights law, relevant international law, and relevant national law. I'm thinking they should probably be added because they're going to need to know that both from a regulatory standpoint and from a contract management, legal standpoint of the contracting. So I suggest they be added into those 3 categories.
Very good. Agreed. Anyone else?
I'm sorry, which one? International humanitarian law, human rights law, and what was the third one?
Relevant national law.
Una, we saw that you had your hand raised and Mohammed unmuted you, so go ahead and speak. She's unmuted, right? Yeah. Okay, Una, you're unmuted, so you can jump in anytime. And if for some reason you're having problems speaking, you can also just type a chat in a comment in the chat box, and we can read it off as well. Okay. One thing to build on what Mike just said, I think too, since there's also the issue, at least the way it's framed in the Montreux document, of home and territorial states being responsible for licensing, potentially, not all states do this of course, but licensing and authorizing PSC and PMC services, we might want to broaden that to include them as well.
Hold on. In particular, remember we have 2 issues. We have home state regulators or authorizing officials, and then we have territorial state. I think we're more concerned with the territorial state than the home state, or am I wrong?
Yeah, I mean, it just depends, I guess, what kind of, and maybe I've just been so imbued in the Montreux document recently that it's in my head right now. But you know, in terms of home states that may have some type of licensing regime in place, at least according to what's laid out in the Montreux document, they're also supposed to ensure that they are only licensing companies that demonstrate themselves as capable of providing their services in a fashion that's respects human rights and humanitarian law. So at least in the Montreux document, that is, you know, a recommended good practice. So it's worth considering.
That is magic cheese.
I think we sent a message. I'm going to read Una's message. I think she's having audio problems. Una says, I was going to suggest clients. The list has commercial operators, security management staff, but as PSCs, our operations can be very closely linked to the way our client operates. There are some relevant points in PSC 1 2 about clients. Message? Yeah. So did you hear that, Chris?
Right, and
Thanks, Una.
that was intended to include commercial operator was intended to include the client, the purchasers of these security services, and rather than because you know I'm sorry, that's what I intended to mean by commercial operators, in this case private sector purchasers of security services. Would it be better if I said it that way?
Yeah, maybe, because that way you're also capturing the fact that there's humanitarian organizations that are using security as well, or other NGOs, not just humanitarian organizations. And folks, feel free at any point to jump in and add comments.
He came down with David Bennett. And then Andy came falling down the road with his cravat on.
I think someone's
I'm going to send it out to everyone. Yeah.
Okay, you need. Okay.
We haven't gotten down this far yet, but I'm just replacing the one title with the other throughout. Okay. Okay, I'll give it just another couple of seconds, and then we'll go down to the next bunch of training subjects.
Sorry, this is Mike Etcherton again. I had one other comment. I apologize I didn't make the last couple of sessions. I was on travel. Are we including the maritime component, or is that on the table, off the table for this particular exercise? Because if it's on the table, then, and you may have had this discussion already, we need to look at flag state, the flag state regulatory role, which may be covered under contracting state. I'm not sure if you've had that discussion or not.
I think that one's going to be covered under home state. The flag state is the home state, or the territorial. Well, I'm sorry, correction. It's a territorial state.
Okay, fair enough. That's good.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure. Thank you.
And of course, the territorial state would also include real territorial states, states that control the territorial waters the ship might have to go through.
Chris, we've got a couple comments here from people that are in noisy operating environments, so they want us to make the comments for them. From Paul Hockley, where are national accreditation services and certification bodies fitting in? Let's address that one first.
Good. We haven't included them because those accreditation bodies and services have been nowhere mentioned in the either the Mantra document, the Code of Conduct, or the other national laws that we derived this list from. So we need to create that as an additional category.
And Chris, while you're adding that in, Una just commented on the remarks from Mike in your response. She says, as Chris uses the term commercial clients, that will include commercial flag states and the maritime piece.
Right, but we've changed that now to security management.
Actually, flag states is the government entity of a country under whose flag that ship sails, so it shouldn't be considered a private sector. That probably needs to be differentiated.
Okay.
Well, okay, so what we've got, right, territorial state is the flag state itself that regulates it. The security management staff of private sector purchasers would include the ship owners. And somewhere else in here, I'll put an asterisk and say this includes these categories.
One other thing too, the commercial operators security management, so that the clients, as I think we redefined it, this is from Lyle Alexander, they should be included under other international standards as well, he's suggesting.
I'm sorry, say that one again.
Yeah, sure. So from Lyle,
years old, I can't think and type at the same time.
I know. I'm thinking that. I'm watching you. I'm like, oh gosh, this is not an easy task. It says other related, where we added the other related international standards, and we had said that would be relevant for PMSC management. Lyle Alexander notes that it's also relevant for the commercial operators security management. So I think what we had just redefined in terms of more broadly the clients. I forget, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the comment, not my screen. Have we just redefined that?
Got it.
Got it, right? Yeah, exactly.
This is actually working better than I thought. Next list.
No, because then you can't see.
By the way, an interesting point is the cultural awareness in sexual exploitation and abuse, gender-based violence. This is one of those areas that I think that as we start to identify specific training outcomes, we're going to see a significant overlap between those two areas.
Yeah, and Chris, wait, back up for 1 sec here, sorry. Una made another comment. She's wrote, linked to my earlier point, it is all the client staff in country, and not just the security management staff, i.e. not just those who manage the PSCs, but all the oil and gas staff, for example, in Africa. So I get her point is that, yeah, that we need to broaden it to the clients.
Okay, now Una, I'm gonna ask Una then, I'm gonna challenge her to come back and say, all right, now you need to tell me what specifically of this list that they need to know. Does everybody who works for a, everybody who's turning a wrench on a pipeline need to understand international humanitarian law, human rights law, and other relevant national law? Just because that this perimeter might be guarded by a PSC?
Yeah, well, I think you can speak now. No mic detected. She has no mic. Okay, sorry, you're gonna have to type. All right, we'll give her a sec there to just put her on the spot. Okay. Now, Chris, I'm sorry. Did you want to pick up on the point that you were making about oh, wait, here, hold on. We're back. The test for me would be whether they have contact with the local community. So, e.g., gender abuse. Okay. Do you hear that, Chris?
Yeah, but now I'm going to throw back again. This is we're talking about training that relates to the employment of private security companies, not what training is going to be required of an international extractive organization.
Okay.
I mean, her point is well made, but it's for a different, I think it's for a different subject than what we've got going right here.
All right, and I'm just gonna. Oh, looks like Sylvia was trying to speak, but she's not sure if anyone could hear her. Is Sylvia unmuted? Sylvia White, at the bottom there. She's unmuted. Yeah, Sylvia, you should be unmuted. No mic detected. Okay, so Sylvia writes, and I'm getting some bad feedback there, Mohammed. In the same way as CTIPs need to be trained, wait, why am I not figuring out that acronym? CTIPs needs to be trained so combat traffic, okay. In the same way as combating trafficking needs to be trained so people understand what to look for so they can stamp out abuse, would the same not be said of basic human rights? Wait, let me read that again. In the same way as combating trafficking needs to be trained so people understand what to look for so they can stamp out abuse, would the same not be said of basic human rights?
Well, I mean, that's why we have human rights law in there, that those categories of people need to be trained. But as far as the general clients of those who are hiring the PSCs, I don't think that exists independently of whether or not they're hiring a PSC or what security method they choose. So I think that, you know, it's like it's a stand. I mean, those things are in our standard contracts for any service that we provide, that they have to do it. It's not unique to PSCs. And just because you hire a PSC doesn't change your requirement as to be trained in those things. So I'm not sure that that's proper to the scope of what we're trying to cover here now. But if someone wants to make the argument that I'm wrong about that, I'm more than willing to listen to it.
Okay, I'm just going to use that opportunity here just to jump in and remind everybody that some of you we've had to mute just because of background noise, and if you're finding yourself muted beyond efforts to unmute, just raise your hand and Mohammed will unmute you. Oh wait, Sylvia wrote something. Yes, agreed, but the point of the PSC hires, yes, agreed, but the point is if the PSC hires someone in a spanner turning role, the spanner turner needs basic training on these.
If the PSC hires someone in a spanner turner role, then the spanner turner needs training on that. I agree, and that I would presume that falls under the categories of PSC, PMC, local national staff, and international staff. We deliberately did not say shooters or guards.
Yeah, so and Sylvia, yeah, Sylvia wrote if they work for the PSC, not if they work for the client. Okay, she's right. Okay. So then let's turn back to the point that you were starting to make there, Chris, a second ago about the training regarding gender-based violence and sexual abuse. So do you mind picking up what you had started saying there?
Okay. I think that as we develop specific learning outcomes for different training elements, that we're going to wind up seeing a overlap. That we're going to have the same outcomes in different training categories, and I think that's going to be especially true in things like cultural awareness, sexual exploitation and abuse, gender-based violence, counter-trafficking in persons, measures against bribery and corruption, which we may see in all four elements. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. That we'll solve that later on, and maybe as we move later on, then we start developing outcomes. If different groups are volunteering, or different institutes are volunteering, take on learning outcomes for different areas, that they need to be aware and work with other organizations that may be working on other training outcome areas, or training areas, to make sure that if wherever possible we identify common training outcomes that answer the mail for both training categories. just something to think about as we move forward.
Yeah, Chris, on a side note on that, what you're just saying there, it just dawned on me because, looking at that list and it just looks so massive. And I'm thinking to myself, depending on how we link up this, the what with the who, I'm wondering if I don't think we have to have a number in our heads, but I'm wondering if it wouldn't make sense to really kind of think really concretely about how to condense some of these where there is overlap and similarities, because I think otherwise this could become, Lord knows how many different types of, courses or what have you, depending on the method of delivery.
Okay, I think that's a good idea, and we need to work on that. But I think that we were originally worried that we wouldn't have enough to talk about during this time frame, but I think it's going to work the other way around. And let's note that and make that for something that we can do on a email blast to everybody afterwards.
Okay. And it looked like who was that? Paul Hockley had a question or a comment. Okay.
Rebecca, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can, Paul.
Excellent, that's good. I just wanted to come back to that accreditation bodies and certification bodies point I made. Obviously, I can see that Chris has put that into the IHL section. It really needs to go into quite a few. What we've been doing in the UK as part of the UCAS pilot, it's obviously pretty important that the national accreditation body as well as the certification bodies have the identified competencies as that they've assessed from PSC 2 and on the maritime side, 28003 and 17021, to actually accredit and certify the relevant bodies. Obviously for the UK it's UCAS accrediting the certification bodies in the pilot, and the certification bodies themselves certify the private maritime and PSCs. What in those circumstances then is that we have to have a look at the standards and identify the relevant law that the accreditation certification bodies have to have competence in. And they pretty much, I would suggest, got two options with the way they go about doing that. And I know this was touched on last week with Sorka and Tony Chattit, and that's very much they're either going to bring somebody in to train them, or they're going to accept that they cannot, in effect, achieve that competence through training, and they'll bring somebody in. Now, what's happened in the UK is that some certification bodies, as part of the pilot, have brought individuals in to train them, whilst others have accepted that they can't, they don't think they can go that route, and they're bringing experts in onto the to actually take part in the audit. Where I think actually the preferred option may be is the training, because it could potentially become cost prohibitive to bring some experts into the certification process itself, because that cost will be passed on to the client, the security company at the end of the day. So I would very much suggest at the moment that if you want to list accreditation certification bodies, they need to go under quite a few of those: human rights, relevant national law, and obviously the PSC 1 in particular, some of the others as well.
Is there any you think that they wouldn't go under? Because now that I think about it, since we're looking here at trainings that have been derived from the standards and they're ultimately certifying companies to those standards, I mean, it seems that they would have to have understanding of all of these.
Yes, no, I would agree with that. Obviously, you're not going to need kind of quite a wide amount of training on some of these.
Right. Yeah.
What the certification body needs to understand in relation to cultural awareness for purposes of certification is probably pretty limited, but potentially, yeah.
Yeah, and in some sense, what I think what they'll have to be able to do is well, here's an interesting point here. So they have to be able to identify whether or not the trainings that are being provided are adequate or not, perhaps, for example, based on the outcomes that we hope to develop. But they don't necessarily need to know the subject matter to that great of an extent, don't you think? But I don't know to what extent. Yeah, right? Okay.
Yes, and that's actually a lot easier to do for PSC 1 than it is the ISO PAC. At the moment, the UK is considering what our national understanding is in relation to the document, i.e. where the bar is in relation to certain aspects, and that includes human rights in particular, as to whether the ISO has the clarity to allow a consistent quality of certification on the ISO PAS alone. So the UK at the moment is looking how we're going to go forward with that.
I'm glad those questions are being asked.
How about if I, for the moment, I eliminate accreditation certification bodies out of all of these, since it applies to all of them, and put in a note saying accreditation and certification bodies need training in all of these areas consistent with their requirements to conduct certification. Because it's going to be a little bit different. It's not, as you said, Paul, it may not be specialized training, because the way a lot of the certification bodies, I understand, are going is that they're going to hire the people who already have these skills and then train them to be auditors if necessary, because it's a lot easier to do that than it is to take auditors and then train them up in all of these different areas.
I thought, from what Tony was saying, that he was taking on board, should we say, operationally experienced, field experienced personnel. I wasn't sure he was taking on people who, should we say, had that legal or background in all the areas we have on the left-hand side here. What Tony has done, he is one of the few certification bodies, as he said last week, who has brought in an outside expert, which was in fact Sorka, to assist, particularly on the human rights aspects. But he is, to my knowledge, the only certification body at this stage who has brought somebody in to do that.
Okay, so let me go back to my the suggestion that I made of take the specific mention of accreditation certification bodies out of this, and then just make a special note saying that accreditation certification bodies will require training in all of these areas consistent with their requirements for auditor training requirements.
And I'm going to actually, Glenn, we're just about to type you a note, but I'm just going to tell you we're going to unmute you because I know you have your hand raised. So we're unmuting you now, Glenn. You're unmuted.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm sorry I joined late, and so I missed the earlier part of this discussion. I just wanted to say that Paul may have mentioned that over last year, I have chaired the Standards and Accreditation Group of the SCEG, which has had a membership not only of private land and private maritime security companies, but also certification bodies, the UK Accreditation Service, government departments, and client representations. And collectively, we have sought to understand what the requirements are for each of those involved in the process. It's been a collective process which I think has helped the certification bodies and the UK Accreditation Service as they move towards the pilot assessments. I should add also that, as I understand it, the certification bodies looked at the possibility of recruiting NGOs to help them in the certification process, but found that no NGO was willing to do so. Therefore, I provided a list of distinguished experts in the fields of IHL and human rights to advise them and help them with training. So I'm sorry, that's just a sort of footnote to the debate, which I thought might be useful. And I think part of training is as much collective understanding as it is actual formal courses.
Wait, Glenn, can you elaborate on that last point?
One thing is to do a formal course and get a sort of credit for it. Another is to have a group of people who have a common interest in developing a process and get them to discuss it among themselves so they all understand what their role is. And that's what I meant by collective understanding as opposed to formal training.
I just want to add, I think that's a really good point, because I think that's getting us also to one of those moments of quality assurance, is that if you can bring together these various stakeholders to have that collective understanding, it should across the board lead to a higher quality type of training and more standardization. So I think that's an important point.
Yep.
All right. So where are we now? Let's see here. Okay, so Chris has added a note about accreditation and certification bodies. Okay. And then maybe we want to scroll back up, Chris, more towards the top again.
Right. I was just trying to make sure that I didn't forget to do what I said I was going to do.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
I want to point out specifically interactions between PMC, PSC, and the military. Notice I put in things like INGO security managers. In this case, I'm not talking about INGOs who are hiring private security services, but those who may not be hiring private security services, but using other methods for security management for their personnel.
Actually, Chris, can you just scroll down a little bit to the handling complaints and reporting incidents? I'm just looking here. I don't see any mention of like contracting officials or home and territorial state officials. I think they would definitely need to be in there as well.
I'm thinking about that. It's an interesting point, and it's probably worth discussing, but exactly who and why, since all the relevant documents that we've been addressing to date really really focus on the requirement of clients to have that in place, the security companies to have that in place, and maybe if you could explain to me what you see as the role of those authorizing officials.
Well, so for example, I mean, like the DoD has in its contracts with PSCs that they need to have systems in place and report all incidents, and you know, there's it doesn't matter. I mean, if there's a any type of firing of the weapon has to be reported, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Right.
So
but we're a client.
Yeah. So when clients need to have some training and understanding whether or not the kind of incident reporting systems that the PSC has in place is adequate or not in meeting those contracting requirements?
Well, yes. Okay. So I just put that in there. That was a missing spot.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have security management staff of private security purchasers who would be handling those things for the non-state clients.
Right. Yeah. And then I'm just thinking, I mean, in terms of, I mean, this is, I don't know how much we want to rely on what is in the Montero document or not. Again, apologies.
Well, I mean, we have to base it on something. So
yeah, so I'm just thinking, I mean, one of the things that, let me pull up my document. One of the things that I think all states contracting home or host are supposed to do is to provide transparency around serious incidents. Hold on, let me just look it up. If we can move the conversation, if someone else wants to jump in real quick while I look it up.
I would challenge you to show me where there's a requirement for transparency about those.
Hold on. Oh, here it is, Chris. It's in Part 2, at least for contracting states. I'll look up for the equivalent in the other states. To ensure transparency and supervision in the selection and contracting of PMSCs, relevant mechanisms may include, of course, these are recommendations, 4C, publication of an overview of incident reports or complaints, and sanctions taken when misconduct has been proven.
Okay, that's a little bit different than transparency of all incidents. It's an overview of incident reports.
Right.
But okay.
It's a transparency measure.
So that's
but I mean, just see if there's equivalence.
And I just put that in there. I just added that in there.
And that's also true for territorial states. That language is mirrored.
Okay. We'll take
as
care
well
of that.
as, let me see if it's mirrored for home states. But again, I mean, it's just that, because I mean, let's not hone up on the details right now. But I mean, what is important is to realize that the type of training that needs to be done is only, I think, to the extent that they're ensuring that the security providers either using or authorizing have adequate mechanisms in place to collect the data, collect the reports, and then pass them on as needed, as determined, for example, in the authorization or in the contract. So it's not going to be the same type of training on handling complaints and reporting incidents as will be, as the, let's say, the PSC management or international staff or local national staff will need.
Got it. Put it in.
And then this is something else I raised, sorry, and please jump in if anyone else wants to jump in, but this is something that I've also raised, I think, in one of the emails. In terms of, actually, we don't have in here, the filing of complaints, but one thing I know we've discussed in the past is the importance that local population be aware of what type of complaints mechanisms are available for them. And I know I don't know if that's a training issue as much as it is. Real quick, this is the thought was I'm just getting at here is I don't know if that's a training issue per se, but there's definitely like an awareness raising issue, and that's also in the PSC 1 standard too, in terms of communicating the existence of those types of complaints mechanisms.
And that's why we put in NGO staff in the area. Again, we're not talking about the security managers, but we're just talking about other NGOs who might be in the area and have the opportunity then to share that information or provide training to the local population.
That's one method for sure, but I mean, I don't know if we can just solely put the onus on the NGOs in the area to, again, I'm not quite sure if this is a raising awareness issue versus a training issue. I don't know if I would even define it as a training issue per se, but that's just the point I wanted to make, is that there needs to be some way of communicating to the local population the existence of complaints mechanisms.
Right. Well, the thought there was, again, if we put NGO staff in the area, that's the way to facilitate the awareness of the local population, and why we didn't put the local population in. And then now that you've also identified the gap and that we didn't have territorial state regulators and authorizing officials, we have that in there too. So we have both local government and NGOs who are operating in the area as being valuable for this training. It may not be required, but valuable for them nonetheless.
Okay.
Because if we're operating in an area of conditions of weakened governance, which is why we're using PSCs to begin with, then if there is a problem or somebody feels like they have been harmed by the use of private security in the area, who are they going to go to complain? Who are they going to go to raise this? And unfortunately, in most cases, it's not going to be to their local government authority. No, true, but I'm talking about in terms of using the complaints mechanisms that companies themselves are supposed to be creating underneath PSC1, ICOC. They're just like, how do they communicate to the local population that they have those? And I'm not. I mean, NGOs in the area are definitely one, but I don't want to get hung up on the topic too long. We're getting into nitty gritty here. It's a little too much, but. Yeah, we're also talking about when you earlier mentioned that we should collapse some of these into a single heading. This is one that there's two very clear subheadings. One is the internal, communicating the internal grievance process, which is required under the ICOC and PSC1, and then the handling of incident reports and other types of complaints, which is outside of that, but really more of a government responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that actually raises another issue. One thing, I don't remember if this came up in an email exchange or not with the whole email burst, but somewhere in here it might be valuable to have some type, and maybe it falls underneath cultural awareness, but to have some type of training with regards to, I don't know what to call it, communication, interaction with the local population. I mean, I know this is something that's been a big issue for, oil, gas, mining companies in terms of how to effectively engage with the local communities. Glenn has a, Glenn writes, no, it's part of it.
Yeah.
Hold on. Go ahead, Glenn.
Hi, no, I was just going to say that you'll find that both the extractives and the PSCs operating in an area will have links and relations with local community leaders as a matter of course, or they're pretty stupid if they don't. There may not be NGOs, but there would always be community leaders of some kind. And part of that process, be it for the client, be it for the PSC, will be, please, if you've got any problems, bring them to us.
Yeah. And frankly, I think they've got a lot of experience in doing that, right? Because, especially with the rise of the whole notion of free, prior, informed consent, there's been a lot of efforts, I think, to, even the earliest planning phases onwards to engage with local communities. So I think there's probably, a skill set there that can be tapped into in terms of what oil companies and gas and mining companies have learned already to date about doing that.
Yes, in what senses?
Well, I think also even the CPA in its days in Iraq started that process with local community leaders. You can read Rory Stewart on the subject when he was Viceroy of southern Iraq.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. You may have noticed that while you were looking, I combined rules for the use of force and continuum of force, realizing that continuum of force is really a subset of rules for the use of force. And now I'm going into weapons qualification, and of course it's the international staff, the local national staff have to be trained in weapons qualification. Is there anybody else?
Chris, can I just ask one question going back to rules for use of force? It's Paul Botley again.
Yes.
Yeah. I think it was raised earlier in relation to terminology of the flag state, the maritime sector. I think there is different requirements for maritime and land. And if you did want to drill down in this, particularly in relation to the rules for use of force, because of the unique relationship between a master and the PCAS, the privately contracted armed service personnel or security personnel on board a ship, it's very different, that relationship, from a standard security role on land, and therefore you would probably expect a master to have a half-decent understanding of the rules for the use of force that are being applied by the PCAS on board his vessel. So in effect, the client in that particular circumstance would probably have some need, at least an understanding, rather than more so perhaps in the land environment. But some of those maritime issues are slightly different, I think, because when you're doing a training needs assessment and you're using the sources, the ISO PAS rather than PSC 1, you will have different requirements come out of that. And of course, at the end of the day, the company will probably be looking at this training from a couple of perspectives. One, obviously because they want to better themselves, but secondly, they're looking for certification. So that will be relevant. So to them, they will be looking at what training do we need to be doing in order to achieve certification to a particular standard.
Okay, and yeah, and that actually applies even within the land-based context as well. An individual who's being hired, for example, to conduct perimeter security at an installation is going to have different, different understanding of what the rules for the use of force are for somebody who is actually a protective security detail for a VIP. So as it is right now, we have security management staff of private sector purchasers in there. And is there some additional category you want to have? I understand you mentioned the ship's masters in particular, and it would be nice that if we could include that, if we could include it in a different way, or something like those who have operational control over the use of force, or something like that. Can
it's really the master.
Pardon me?
It would be the master.
But that's not necessarily just specific to ships. I'm thinking, because you have other people who have actually even land-based that may actually have operational control over over the PSC.
Hey, this is Mike Edgerton. I think the point's valid regarding land, but the relationship between a master, the flag state, the vessel, and anyone who's on that vessel is pretty well encapsulated or captured in international maritime law. And I think we actually addressed some of this relationship in PSC 4, if I recall. I don't have it in front of me, but I remember a fairly robust discussion regarding the unique role of a shipmaster when we did PSC 4. I do, based on the discussion, I do think that needs to probably be pointed out specifically. The language doesn't necessarily have to say ship's master, but it has that ship's master, to put it in military terms, is going to have a degree of OPCON or TACON over the private security company that is probably legally unparalleled on land. I'm not an expert on the land-based, but I suspect, based on international maritime law, it's a much more firm level of control on anything that happens on that ship. So I think it's probably worth putting in there as some sort of caveat. I don't know that it needs to be, I don't know that we need to create a new category, but I'm just wondering if there's some sort of caveat we can put in there that ship masters have a unique role on this somehow. And I'm just, something I can maybe think about submitting some language on if everyone agrees.
Okay, I put that in there right now. I think that if we can come up with a little bit better language, none of these terms right now are, they're just things to keep their aids of memory right now, rather than being specifically defined categories. So if anybody can come up with better terminology than we're using right now that captures the population group that we're seeking to address, please send them in, and we'll incorporate them as we move forward. So if you can consider something better than what I've written right there for special considerations for ship masters, please send it along.
And Chris, I'm going to use this moment of silence here just to raise a broader point that Sylvia had brought up when we're going here to some pretty great degree of granularity in terms of describing what needs to be trained and who. And she raised the point of that there, and I quote, the danger with spoon-feeding what everyone must do trained is that it potentially leads to companies ticking the boxes and missing the point, and this is the point that organizations must ensure this is part of the organization's culture if it is to be really meaningful. So just a broader issue that she brought up there.
Very important, because if people don't buy into it and understand why they need this training, this is all useless.
Yeah.
And I think that part of that will come out as we further refine these general training categories, as you suggested earlier, Rebecca, and try to collapse them into one, several into one training area. That would allow people to focus a little bit better, because right now the list is fairly daunting.
Yeah. And actually, it gets back to a point that Mike Gambone raised on one of the emails, I think, in terms of the corporate culture in some sense. He had brought it up, and I hope I'm not misquoting. Mike, I see you're online. Jump in if you want to. But you had brought up the issue of how to ensure that the trainings are actually having the desired impacts in terms of actually shaping behavior. And you had actually raised some issues which I think were more generally attributable to general workplace conduct. And one thing that I had said in response was that I thought that in many ways the kind of climate at the workplace could have very direct impacts in terms of actually ensuring the type of behavior that we want to encourage with regards to respect for human rights and humanitarian law. So yeah, feel free to jump in and add there, because I think this gets us back, links us back to the culture question that Sylvia raised.
And by the way, this is the bottom of the list now, so if we can get through this in the next 5 minutes or so, we'll have the opportunity to look at the next page, which is methods of delivery of training.
Okay. You know, Chris, one thing that dawned on me, and this relates back to the comment that I think Paul made with regards to the certification and accreditation bodies having to have some familiarity in all these issues, at least to the extent necessary, to assess whether or not the company has the adequate procedures in place. It seems to me similarly that a lot of these are requirements also that the contracting officers would need to be familiar with in terms of being able to assess whether or not a company is fulfilling the terms of its contract. So I don't know. I don't know if that's worth a side note somewhere, but it's something also worth thinking about.
Right. Yes. When we wrote down contracting officials, the intent was the people who are actually responsible for writing the contracts, and then the people who are overseeing the execution of the contracts was assumed to be in the security management staff. So let's take because again, the guys who write the contracts are going to have different requirements than the guys who actually oversee the execution of the contracts. Who may not even be part of the contracting apparatus of the company or the organization. But let's make sure that we haven't created, unintentionally allowed any gaps in this. And this isn't the be-all and end-all. This isn't the end state of this. You've all have access to these sheets, and if you see anything else over the next week or so, please feel free to offer the suggestions and send them in.
Okay. Should we move on to the next sheet then? Yeah.
Now, the challenge is, as we brought up before, is that in many cases, yes, you can do classroom training. Yes, you can do virtual training. You also need to do field training. And sometimes you can say, well, I'm just going to do this virtually, or I'm going to do this online, which includes an online course. But that's not enough. You know, it needs to be virtual training that then needs to be followed up with classroom training or something like that. And it's hard to catch that in a matrix like this, but I tried. If I got it wrong somewhere, you know, let me know. And let me let you take a look at what the single stars and double stars mean real quick. So the bottom double star means that there are some things which can be trained in-house, but only after in-house training refers to the training which is actually developed in-house, not training which is being provided on a train-the-trainer concept where the company has sent somebody out to be certified to deliver that training, and then it's provided in-house.
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
Okay. In-house training refers to training which is developed in-house as well as delivered in-house, not to training which was developed outside, that the company sent someone on a train to be trained and certified to conduct that training and then provides the training in-house. So it refers only to subjects which are developed and delivered entirely in-house.
Oh, okay. And then the reason that you don't have X's for the humanitarian law and human rights law is because I'm assuming you think that there's then the requirement that outside expertise be brought in.
When we're talking about something which does, in fact, rely upon which are laws and have a tremendous negative impact if you get it wrong, then I think that the liability issues require you to get some sort of certified training program. And I'll give you an example right now. We have a horribly inadequate system or requirement for training in law of armed conflict for private security companies. It's horribly inadequate because it's actually designed for military personnel, not for PSCs. But if a company can show then that it conducted its training according to that format, according to that module that's included in the training in the contract packages, then at least they can say we met the training requirement for international humanitarian law, law of armed conflict, that was required by the government that hired us. So it gives them some sort of protection, saying that wasn't our opinion, that was somebody else, that was a competent legal authority's opinion about what we should train.
Mm-hmm. And in the case of commercial providers, what was your thinking there?
The same. I just didn't think that a commercial provider would be willing to take on the risk of when something bad happened and someone violated commercial international law, that they were able to then go back and say, hey, this is the training that ABC expert training provided to us, and so therefore they're responsible.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that.
But Paul, if you want to say that you're willing to take that liability on, I'm more than willing to put next there.
I think we may have lost Paul. You still there?
No, I am here. I'm just.
Oh, yeah, there you are.
Yeah, I'm in the Home Office at the moment, and I'm walking around. So, well, to be honest, I suppose we've got to look at what the liability is of the trainer. I mean, I'd be quite content to train people on international humanitarian law and human rights law, and I have done. I've provided training for certification bodies as part of the pilot. But the issue for me in those circumstances really is, can I give an audit? Can I kind of can I go back and say, well, actually, if there were questions asked, this is what I covered. So I'd be reasonably content with that, to be honest. But at the same time, as a commercial provider in some of these areas, I would look to work alongside academics, to be honest, and that's the way I would approach it. So particularly with the IHL and the human rights law, because the reason for that is I think the key thing with any training is to make it relevant. And one of the issues, one of the benefits of potentially a commercial provider who probably has a better tactical level understanding of the environment is that he has the experience, and therefore the training that he can deliver or she can deliver is less from an ivory tower and is more bespoke to the individuals receiving the training.
I love that term bespoke, which is used so often in the United Kingdom and is totally unintelligible to Americans. But I understand. But I did study, so now I understand what it means. The idea here is that, as you said, you work alongside of academics, and you want to avoid the ivory tower approach. And that's why the little asterisk next to both academic and governments is that they would probably be more suited to a train-the-trainer concept, where you would send your trainer to an academic institution to get certified to train it on those elements, and then you can then provide the bespoke training to your client based upon that. Again, though, if you want me to if you think that it's well and suitable to put an X in the commercial providers there, I would be I'll do that.
Well, I'd be happy to put it in there. I don't know if there's anyone else online who's in the same boat as me.
There is, of course, always a possibility that, I'll put it there, maybe not an X, maybe a Y or something like that, because I can see that governments may, in fact, not allow you to do that through a commercial provider or in-house unless it's a externally certified training program.
I was going to say, actually, that's a good point, Chris. I was just going to raise that it's not, I don't think it's problematic per se to have commercial providers of, IHRL training or IHL training, but I do think that what would be very essential is that this is linked up to the quality assurance question. How do you know that you actually have people delivering those trainings who really have an understanding of human rights and humanitarian law? Gain in the field or in the ivory tower.
Can I come in?
Sure, Glenn, go ahead.
It's a problem I raised before. The commercial providers are not in situations of armed conflict. They leave. They don't go in there. They're in the complex emergencies. Their focus, therefore, is very much on human rights rather than IHL. And when I raised this before, Chris said, but look at Libya. When the situation went pear-shaped, then the PSC wasn't prepared. But PSCs operate in self-defense. They don't operate in offensive actions. And what their responsibilities would then be would be to help their clients leave safely rather than fight their way out to the extent that it's possible. So I have to say I think that the commercial providers are in a very different situation to governments.
Chris, you there? Oh,
Yes. Okay. No. I'm here. Of course, the reality, Glenn, is that those companies did, in fact, wind up getting involved in direct participation hostilities because they did fight their way out, and that's the situation that we're trying to avoid. But your point is well taken. So I'm going to put it into a why and then try to figure out what we can actually define as a why, and move on. To caveat that, just that there may be situations where that's not going to be allowed or inappropriate. It's not universal, something like that. If someone can come up with some words for that, I would be greatly appreciative.
I think it's what you might call residual training. In other words, if the situation should go pear-shaped, this is what you can and can't do. But as I say, if you tell any client that they're likely to be involved in international armed conflict or whatever, they're just not going to go there.
Well, that goes back into our previous discussions about the levels of training that's going to be required.
Yep.
So a basic understanding of what you can and can't do versus, okay, now you're in a situation where it's really going to be that way, and you really need to know. So that comes into the outcomes. The outcomes are going to be very, very context and even individual function specific. I did not put an X for commercial providers on sexual exploitation and abuse, but gender-based violence. That was just my guess. Do I need to put an X there?
Was that again because of the concerns about potential risks and liabilities involved? Or what was
absolutely.
Your...
Yeah, that even more so in terms of risks and liabilities from a legal context, and especially a civil liability and tort context, than just the fact that governments may insist that this kind of training can only be provided by an accredited or certified training program.
Yeah, I really, I have a general question to raise, and I don't have the answer to this. Perhaps those that work more closely with certification bodies or accreditation bodies would know. But are there really many examples of an accreditation or certification body being sued because they had certified someone who then demonstrated themselves as actually not being in compliance with whatever standard they were being certified to? I mean, are there a lot of cases of that? Is that? I guess I'm asking I'm asking how serious a risk is this? And Paul, maybe you know. I don't know.
I think there's a rather large one ongoing at the moment in relation. I think it's to do with the breast implants in France. There's a big liability issue on that. I think one of the issues though with commercial providers is how we, and it comes back to what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, how that training is accredited. I mean, I've noted it because I'm a commercial provider, but I am a lawyer, and it's particularly when you're delivering legal training, I've struggled to identify ways that we can accredit legal training, because anyone can deliver legal training. It doesn't have to be a lawyer. Academic institutions, obviously, they're not accredited, but one expects them to be experts. And so it is almost a slightly unregulated area, in my view, the delivery of legal training.
and how you actually say what is the right qualification to have to deliver a certain type of training, and how does somebody become an expert to deliver that?
On another point, in another area that I'm somewhat more personally familiar with, I happen to be a flight instructor as well, and I do know that when a pilot crashes, they always go after the last flight instructor who gave the pilot a flight review, saying that you obviously provided improper training to him. And in this case, the flight instructor is in fact accredited and recertified biennially by the federal government. So there's no protection for them, and they are brought into court.
Yeah, but I'm guessing as with any other type of service industry, where you're providing things, whatever, that if there is these risks, that there would be some kind of insurance that one has. I mean, does that necessarily preclude commercial providers from offering these types of courses? I don't know. I feel it may be a bit of a. I'm not sure the dangers are as great as we think. And if they are, they could be mitigated through insurance.
I don't have a problem about putting it in there. As I'm just wondering whether the risk appetite, as PSC 1 says, is there.
Yeah.
Rebecca, it's Allie Hawks.
Hi, Allie. Go ahead.
Hi. I think on that point too, I think that it's quite an important point to look at to the extent of liability of the trainer. But also I understand what Chris is saying about the flight training. But I also think too for lawyers and other professions, and you have to take this kind of continuing education. If you then commit malpractice, they don't go back to kind of the certifying body or the people giving the training saying, clearly they took this class and they committed malpractice, it's your fault. So I think that is definitely a point for clarification, the extent of liability of the trainer.
And I'm just going to add something else that Sylvia White just raised. She writes, I think the flight instruction and breast implant issues, there's a much closer relationship from certification, failing, and damage. The PSC 1 certification is much broader.
Okay. No. Well, as you notice, I started putting whys in there and the things that we need to think about as we move forward, that you could do that. And I'll put similar whys I'll put into in-house instruction too. Again, it's all a matter of risk appetite.
Yeah.
Okay, it's 11:57 now, Rebecca. Did you want to take over and say what we're going to do next?
Yeah, sure. So this is what Chris and I had discussion. This is what we're thinking of doing. Basically, as we have noted, there's a large number of areas for training listed here, but we thought it might make sense to start kind of with 4 of the kind of more important, more meaty ones. Those being the IHL, or Law of Armed Conflict, or however you want to call it, human rights, rules in the use of force, and cultural awareness, bearing in mind that we may be able to subsume some of these topics underneath those 4 broad topics. And what we thought it'd be important to do was to see if we could potentially create here among us, and of course realizing that not everyone's here today, we should be doing some outreach to include potentially the people who haven't actually participated in the webinars but have particular expertise, to develop 4 working groups to start thinking not of developing trainings themselves, but rather to think about developing what kind of outcomes we would want from these trainings. And of course that is going to vary based on who the trainees are. But that's really important, I think, at a number of levels. First of all, it's a really important moment, as I've already said, of quality assurance, is that we have all these different potential training providers identified, but how do we know if what they're doing is good or not and is having the desired impacts? So one way of doing that is to really develop the outcomes, and from the outcomes, of course, then eventually working backwards. The providers can do this, working backwards to actually develop the trainings. And then what we're thinking is that we would maybe find someone to chair of these 4 working groups in these areas. They could take the lead on drawing. We have the email burst, maybe sending out a note, stating that they're They're basically going to be chairing this and trying to draw on others who might like to support them in the working group. And then to have then some kind of, I have to think about deadlines, I haven't really thought about that yet to be honest, but to have some kind of reconvening of the whole larger group of participants who've been active in these webinars so that they can share out some of their initial results in terms of developing those outcomes. That'd be important at a number of different levels. First of all, to make sure that there's no overlap going on because as we said, there are potential room for overlap. Just in particular, I'm thinking with regards to cultural awareness training and human rights training. A lot of those issues that may be raised will fit under both categories. So number one, ensuring that there's no overlap, and then also second, to make sure that there's consistency. That where there is potentially some repetition of the trainings, which isn't always a bad thing, that there also is consistency in terms of what expected outcomes are. So someone do a reality check with me. Did that make sense? Was that clear? Chris, do you think was that clear?
Well, it was clear to you and me when we talked with
I know. That's what I want to know if it's registering to everybody else. Anybody? Bueller? Okay. Well, let me ask this. So is there anyone who'd be interested in maybe just taking the lead as a working group chair on one of these 4 issues? Again, international humanitarian law, human rights, rules and use of force, and cultural awareness. And again, I know we're all very busy people, so I want to stress what this is. This isn't about creating a working group to actually develop trainings. This is about having working groups that have a discussion about outcomes. What do we expect from the trainings? What do people need to be able to demonstrate? Because that's really ultimately what we're trying to get at in terms of shaping behavior. And from there we need to work backwards in terms of, well, how do you train someone so they're actually behaving in that fashion, it's having this desired outcome.
The requirement for IHL training is primarily a government interest item, so I will be very happy to take that on and try to convince the International Institute of Humanitarian Law to also join. And then while we're on the same topic, I will also mention that I am part of the drafting committee for the UNODC's effort for the rules for the use of force handbook.
Good, and maybe UNODC would also be interested since they seem very interested in these webinars and having some additional input into what they're developing. Well, then I will volunteer to take on the Human Rights Working Group because that's something obviously lies close to my heart. Is there anyone out there who's interested in cultural awareness and who wants to tackle that? Serving as a working group chair? Okay, well we'll leave that open then for now. And I think what we'll do is this will have to wait a week until I know a couple of you are also going to be in Montreux next week for the ISO and the Montreux +5 conference. So I think what I suggest we'll do is that we kind of write up a brief email summarizing kind of where we've landed at here in terms of identifying our next steps. Chris, we can maybe circulate the updated matrix that you've been working on, request further input because that's going to be an important document for the working groups when they think of making the links between the what and the who and identifying the outcomes based on that. And then maybe we can find someone who's interested in volunteering to tackle the cultural awareness working group and share that. So that's a biggie. And I just oh wait, Sylvia White just volunteered. Yay, Sylvia! Sylvia just volunteered. The cultural Sylvia, you're saying cultural awareness? Yes, she will. Okay, awesome. Okay, good. Well then, maybe yeah. So I think that's maybe after next. Mike. Oh, and Mike Edgerton just said he's interested in participating in the rules and the use of force. So why don't we do this? I will, not before next week, I'm just not promising that. After we get back, I will send out an email. We'll announce the working group chairs, and then folks can chime in and say where they're interested in participating as a member of the working group. And then maybe what we'll do then also is have a brief call with the working group chairs to discuss procedure, how we move forward. Yeah. Chris, is there anything I'm missing?
No, I think that's a great great next step. Of course, you know, some of us will be in Montreux next week, and we can.
Oh yeah, I guess we can talk face to face.
Yeah.
True, very true. Okay, well, I think that's it. We've actually, I don't know if any of you, oh sorry, go ahead. Glenn, is that you?
Yeah, Rebecca, I was just going to suggest, I think the heart rather sinks at the idea of 4 working groups meeting in parallel. I was wondering if you might follow the same example as hitherto and have them sequential at the same time. In other words, one would begin with the IHL one for 1 week, and then the HR, and then the other 2. And that might help people who are interested in all 4 find the time to take part. I think if you have them all meeting in parallel,
Right.
you're going to lose participants.
That's a very good point.
Glenn, on the other hand, I don't think that this is going to, determining outcomes, if that's what we're trying to do, training outcomes, is not going to be the matter of a couple of weeks of a few minutes a day for any one of these, but is actually going to require some time. And so if we do things
that is actually a wider concern, that I simply haven't had time to focus on the matrix. But I wonder if we're not getting a little bit too utopian in terms of the practicability of all this. And one really, I think, needs to just perhaps talk about this in the margins of next week. I think beginning with your outcomes, what is it we want to achieve and how can we make this work in practical terms rather than going after the ideal?
Okay, so we're looking at an intermediate step before we actually define what the learning outcomes are in each subject.
I think that would be a very good idea.
I think that's the right approach. Okay. I can support that. Rebecca, anyone else?
Yeah, sure, that works as well. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for that suggestion, Lynn. That's a very good point, and hopefully we'll have folks who are interested in participating in multiple groups. Obviously, there's a lot of linkages between these issues. Okay. So I'd just like to thank all of you for participating so actively. I can just, looking at the names, those of you who are left online have been some of those who have been with us the whole time. And so thanks for that support. And I will be sure, though I know there's many others who've been also actively participating that just possibly couldn't be here today. So we'll be sure to send out the email to the burst with all this information in terms of what we've decided here. And yeah, I hope to see a number of you next week in Montreux, and otherwise I look forward to interacting with all of you in the working groups. And I also just want to extend a really big thanks to Chris Mayer. Chris has been so essential in making all of this happen, and has done a lot of the background work in terms of developing the scenario, in terms of developing, obviously, this matrix that we're using, and just really has been tremendous to work with us. So thanks, Chris, to you for taking the time and for doing all this. So, okay, great. Well, thank you, all of you. Enjoy your weekends. Bye-bye.